Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Glad you've joined me for today's devotion. We are in chapter 22 of the book of Acts, and I have to say, I am blown away. I am so inspired every time I read this story because Paul was so bold and so passionate when it came to sharing the story of how Jesus had changed his life. You remember in chapter 21, he had been beaten within an inch of his life and rescued by the Roman soldiers. In fact, beaten so badly he can't walk. They're having to carry him up the steps. And when they get him out of the mob and up the steps, he asked them to let him stop there and speak to the Jewish people in the temple who had just beaten him almost to death. And in chapter 22, we have Paul sharing his story, his testimony. The fact that Paul loved them enough to rather than turn around and condemn them, but to share with them what God had done in his life and his passion. I mean, these are the people who tried to kill him, and he's telling them about Jesus. And we won't even talk to our neighbors about Jesus. We won't talk to our co-workers about Jesus. We're afraid to talk to relatives about Jesus. Well, hardest people to witness to are his family. No, that's not true. That's a lie from the devil to cause you to be quiet. Stop repeating that. It's not true. People are people, whether they're your family or not. Paul's boldness and passion to share the gospel should inspire all of us to speak up. But what I want to talk with you about is Paul's story itself, because you could really look at Paul's testimony, his story here, and divide it into three sections or three parts. Verses 3 through 5, he shares with them what he was doing before he met Jesus. He was persecuting believers in Jerusalem, had authority to go to Damascus and persecute them as well. He beat them. He talks about execution. He talks about putting men and women in prison. And then in the middle of it, in verses 6 to 16, he tells the story of how he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. And then in verses 17 to 21, how after that he was in Jerusalem, he was in the temple and had this trance, this vision, and God made it really clear to him what he was supposed to spend the rest of his life doing. So you can divide Paul's testimony into three parts here: his life before he met Jesus, the details of how he met Jesus, and then his life after he met Jesus, his ministry to the Gentiles. And you and me, no matter what age we were when we were saved, whether it was 8 years old, 18 years old, 48 years old, we have those three parts to our story, our testimony before Jesus. Even if you were a child, your story before Jesus is you grew up in a Christian home. You grew up going to church, perhaps. That's your story. Then you have the story of when you accepted Jesus. How did you meet Jesus? And then you have the story of what your life has been like since, or how has Jesus changed your life, or what are you doing? What does Jesus mean to you today? Every believer, all of us as disciples, have those three parts to our testimony, to our story: our life before Jesus, how we met Jesus, and our life since Jesus. And if I were to try to think of, say, a key word for each of those three parts when it came to the Apostle Paul, I would summarize or outline his testimony this way. Persecutor. That was his life before Jesus. He was a persecutor of the church. Dramatic. His conversion experience when he met Jesus, very dramatic. And after Jesus, I'd use the word Gentiles, because his ministry was to the Gentiles. And I could take those three words, persecutor, dramatic, and Gentile, and tell you the life story of the Apostle Paul. I think about my own story. A word that would describe me, my story before I met Jesus, was interested. Being interested in the things of God, even though I didn't know much about him, and I could talk about that. Meeting Jesus, Uncle Don, my uncle, Donald Eugene Pruitt. And I'd talk about how he shared the gospel with me. And my life since, I'd either use the word sponge or blinders, because after I got saved, I felt like a sponge soaking up God's word, or blinders fell from my eyes and I saw everything differently, and what that's meant for me since. I could use those words: interested, Uncle Don, a sponge, or blinders. And if I just had those in my mind, I could talk to someone and share the story of Jesus. and what he's done in my life. You have three parts to your story. And I'd love to encourage you to sit down and think about, maybe write out in bullet fashion, the three parts of your story. Your life before Jesus, how you met Jesus, and your life since Jesus, and maybe think about a key word that summarizes each of those parts. Like before Jesus for me, interested. For Paul, persecutor. Meeting Jesus for me, Uncle Don. For Paul, dramatic experience on the Damascus Road. Life after Jesus for me, a sponge or blinders falling from my eyes. For the Apostle Paul, Gentiles. What are the three parts of your story? What are the details, the specifics? And then what's maybe three words or phrases that you could use to summarize it. So if you have the chance to talk to somebody, you have those three words in your mind, and you could just use that as an outline and just talk naturally, not having to memorize anything, just those three words. I encourage you to work on that, and this week to share your story with someone and invite them to Jesus and invite them to church Sunday. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 23.